Hi, Tyler Stalman. There are a few things more exciting than getting a brand new camera, and I just did. I got a Canon C70, and every time I upgrade, there are some very important steps that I take, and I'm gonna walk you guys through that. Whether you're a professional and you've bought dozens of cameras over your life, or this is your first camera upgrade, you gotta follow these steps if you wanna take good photos or videos. Step number one, read the manual. This is how I learned photography at first, is I'd go through photography manuals to really understand how exposure works and what ISO does. There's a lot of useful information in there. These days, manuals don't usually get printed on paper and included in the box. You might have to look it up online, but just Google your camera name and manual and it's gonna come up as a PDF. And this video is basically just giving you homework, but this is totally worth doing. Even now, I still try to read my manuals front to back when I get a new camera, because every camera is completely different. While you're at the camera store, you're probably gonna wanna pick up a few accessories. I know that's exciting. It's like you've got a new thing and you want all the gadgets to go with it, but I would definitely caution you to not buy it all at once. Well, first of all, what are you gonna need? Certain things like batteries are completely necessary. So for me, I always have at least 2 for every camera, more like 4 if you're a working photographer. And generally, I try to recommend sticking with first-party batteries that are from the manufacturer of your camera, because I've heard too many horror stories of when things go wrong. The only exception for that is if you're a filmmaker. Things like V-Lock or gold mount batteries, those larger ones, can really be helpful in extending your battery life. But if you're putting it inside of your camera, make sure that you're only buying from reputable brands. And same thing goes with memory cards. Buy from brands that you know. I have a ton of different cards that I've been using over the years, and I've gotten to know the quirks of different ones. You also need to test your memory cards for your new camera. Every camera has different requirements. So for example, when I'm shooting stills on this, I've always used cards that are at a speed of V30, which is some of the slower cards, but they work totally fine with the Canon R, even shooting in burst mode. What I discovered when I picked up the C70 is that you really need faster cards for it to work. So V90 is the bare minimum. That's 300 megabytes per second. And you gotta be looking at the write speed, not just the read speed. So that's how fast can the camera put data onto your card. Don't cheap out on your cards. This is the only way that you won't lose photos. And I can be a little more specific about the testing. So if you're shooting stills, if you're a photographer, one good way to test is to shoot quickly in burst mode. So after you've taken a whole bunch of photos, maybe even more than that, you want to see how quickly do they write to the card. So right now I'm looking at the blinking and the reading on the back of the camera. And if it takes too long to write those photos, you can end up waiting for your camera before you can take the next photo. So based on the speed that you shoot it, make sure that the cards are going to be able to keep up with how fast you're taking images. And then when it comes to video, on the C70, those requirements of faster cards are specifically about slow motion. So if I'm shooting 4K at 120 frames per second, that's when it's required to have a V90 card. Otherwise, it actually records pretty well to the V30 cards. You just gotta test it yourself. So record for a long time, let it run on and on, try some faster frame rates, just try to break it. Try to make it so that the buffer will overflow, and then you'll know your limits once you're in a real photo shoot. One accessory I consider to be a must-have is an Arca Swiss plate. It's on the bottom of all of my cameras, and Arca Swiss isn't a brand, it's a shape of tripod plate, and it works on a lot of different accessories, like this Peak Design tripod I've got. It just clips right on, and then it is secure. There's a wide variety of plates that use this standard, so I can clip it onto tripods. I have backpacks I can clip it on. It's just a universal standard, and I buy them for every single camera. You're also gonna need batteries. Your camera's gonna come with one, but you must have at least 2. I usually have 3 or 4 for each camera. I've been on YouTube for 11 years now, and I've always thought it was annoying when people asked you to subscribe. It's like, I don't owe you anything, but I just realized in some recent videos, it can actually be helpful. And so I'm giving you a reminder now. If you like this kind of content, you should subscribe, because there's gonna be a whole lot more of it. And I know most of you aren't subscribed yet. So now is a good time to click that red button just down here. When you're starting out a lens collection, it can be very helpful to start with a zoom lens so you can figure out what kind of focal length is most useful to you. This is a 24-70. And then as you get a better sense of what each focal length does, then a fixed lens makes more sense. So this is a prime lens, it doesn't zoom in and out. And so is this Fuji. This is a fixed 35mm equivalent. But if you haven't bought lenses before, you don't know which one you want. So a good way to decide is to take that zoom lens and just kind of fix it at one number and spend a whole day shooting like that. And then you'll get a sense of what 35 millimeters feels like, and if that's the next lens that you want to buy. Oh, and try not to buy any lenses that have a variable f-stop, meaning as you zoom in, the lens gets darker. So I would much rather have a lens that is constantly at 4.0 than changes from 2.8 to 5.6 or something like that. If you see an aperture range, stay away. I do not like those lenses. And then we've got to start testing our cameras. So I've got to actually do this with the C70 so I can get used to it. First of all, we're going to look at the high ISO. What are the limits of noise that are acceptable from this sensor? And this has come a long way. Like you might remember when the Sony a7S II was letting us shoot in moonlight, which was amazing at the time. All cameras have gotten a bit better since then, but you want to see what is acceptable for you. I think this camera looks pretty solid up to 3200. I'm going to try to limit myself to 16 typically and add more light if I need to go past that. But again, this is to your taste. If you shoot documentaries, it's very different than if you're shooting commercial in studio. And you're able to do more noise removal if you're shooting stills. Also, if you're shooting JPEGs, it's going to do internal noise removal, whereas if you shoot RAW, you have to do it in software. So there's all these little things to consider. It's different for everybody. That's why I'm saying you've got to do your tests. Don't just look at the results on YouTube. The other ISO test starts with a Google search. You've got to check what is the native ISO of your camera, because that can really affect the dynamic range of your images, especially in video. It matters a little less when you're shooting stills, but with the Canon R, for example, I didn't realize at first how much of an impact it would make if I shot in Canon log at any ISO below 400. My highlights were totally blown out, and I didn't even realize this was happening for a while. The Canon C70, its base ISO is 800, so anything below that and you're starting to give up dynamic range, you just got to know the specifics of your camera. Sony's are different, Panasonic's different, Fuji's different. They all have different base ISOs, and I mean, every camera's different. So look up what the manufacturer recommends, do some tests yourself, and find out where you like to shoot it. And let's keep testing. Another important thing is shooting over and under exposed photos so that you know how much room you have to adjust in post. This is super important because usually most cameras like to be exposed a little bit over or under. So for example, older Canon sensors like the R, when you underexpose them, they can bring up a bit of extra noise in the shadows, whereas Sony sensors love to be underexposed when it comes to photography, because when you have a raw image and you lift that exposure, the noise in the shadows is really clean on a Sony. Again, you got to figure this out for your camera. It's going to be different, so do these tests. One of the most important tests is to do your exposure test. So what does the camera look like over and underexposed? We're going to do that with the C70 right now. And what we're looking for in the overexposed shots is not only what do the highlights look like, but how much can you recover them? So if we lower it in post, sky's still there, is there any color left in my skin, or does it just completely fall apart? And we're going to gradually move from way overexposed to a little bit overexposed, and then properly exposed. And then as we start to go underexposed, we're going to see how much noise is there in the shadows. And each camera is really different if it wants to be slightly under or overexposed. So again, look up the manufacturer's recommendations, see what other YouTubers recommend. For example, the C70 wants to be basically correctly exposed. That's where you can extract the most information. But my last camera, the C200, always wanted to be about 1 to 2 stops overexposed. Every camera is different. Do some tests. And the next test, autofocus. Again, check out the manuals and like what people have said online about any limitations of, sometimes cameras can't do autofocus in 4K slow-mo or whatever it is, but be aware of how your autofocus works and then try it for yourself. For example, when I'm wearing thicker rim glasses, I often find that eye tracking starts to fail, or any facial recognition at all. Like it'll just totally lose my face just because I have glasses on, which is not very smart of a smart tracking system. But sit down in front of your camera, move around a bunch, see what it locks onto, have somebody run towards you, ride a bike towards you. All this stuff is really helpful so that you know how much can you trust autofocus in the field and when do you maybe need to flip over to manual. And when you're starting out a filmmaking or photography career, one thing on your checklist should be a great website, and you know who can help you with that. Squarespace. They've got the best, most beautiful websites, and that's where I've had mine hosted for years now. You already know about their super customizable templates that look great on mobile devices, but they have some new tricks up their sleeve too, like the members only area. It's the perfect way to connect with your audience and generate revenue through a gated members only community. So you can manage email communications, member access, all this stuff. It's really powerful. And you can go one step further with mailing lists so that you can reach your community in their inbox. And a quick tip for filmmakers, Squarespace has this concept of video blocks, and it's this easy way to display YouTube or Vimeo videos within your website. You can add a custom thumbnail over top of it, so it looks completely integrated and seamless into your design. So now would be a great time to head to squarespace.com to start building a new website. It will be very easy. You can get it up in a few minutes, and when it's ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Tyler Stalman, and you're going to get 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks again, Squarespace. Another one for the checklist, stabilization. So on the C70, I've only got digital stabilization, and that can cause issues. If the subject is in the middle of the frame in just the wrong way, it'll stabilize the subject while the background gets wobbly. Meanwhile, Panasonic stabilization is like rock solid and feels like a gimbal sometimes. But what are you looking for? Like I said, you could have that digital warping stabilization, or if you have sensor or lens stabilization, you might spot some jitters or jerkiness as you turn or move up and down quickly. You can see the stabilizer trying to catch up with your movement. That's not ideal, but you should know about it so that you can avoid it when you're using your camera. Another decision to make is what kind of compression are you going to shoot in? If you're shooting stills, are you going to be using RAW or JPEG? This is an important team that you're going to be joining, and I strongly recommend RAW, so think about it. Personally though, I actually used compressed RAW like all the time. I really like it, especially on the Canons. It has all the dynamic range and white balance and exposure flexibility. The biggest difference seems to be some sort of JPEG style compression that you only see when you zoom in past 100%. But different cameras are different. And then when it comes to video, you've got way more choices to make. You might be shooting in MP4 or XFAVC or ALL-I or IPB. There's a lot of acronyms out there and they mean different things, and I'm not going to explain them in this video. Personally though, if you're wondering, I like XFAVC on most cameras that I use, and shooting in IPB, I find that the ALL-I compression is invisibly different. You do not see it look any better. It's just easier on your computer and a little faster to edit with. For filmmakers, if you're shooting in a flat profile like log, you're going to want to find a good transform LUT. I don't recommend doing this manually yourself, transforming log, because it can look ugly real quick. This is very specific to each camera. It's one thing I much prefer about Canons and also Fujis. They have beautiful color right out of the camera, and you don't have to think about it. You just turn on their log profiles and it looks great once you convert it. Sony's, on the other hand, I mean, I owned a few Sonys and I spent so long researching like what's the best cine profile and S-Log 2 versus 3 versus, I mean, it's kind of messy. I don't want to be thinking about that. I just want to choose a profile, know that it's the best one, and run with it. If you're on a Canon, I can help you out a little bit. I do have transform LUTs for C-Log 2 and C-Log, and also a film emulation LUT that you can put on top of those, and then that is linked in the description. Your next bit of homework is to go and assign custom buttons and menus as you need them on your camera. So on Sony's, they really expect you to do this work yourself. In fact, most of the buttons aren't even labeled on the camera. They're just called like custom 1, custom 2. And it can be really helpful. Great examples, let's say you have an A7R4 and you're primarily a video shooter, you can assign some video buttons even though it's mostly a stills camera. But I want to caution you, as you customize your camera, don't go too far. There's always going to be that moment that you hand your camera to somebody else to take a photo or video for you, and they will be totally lost, and you'll have to explain to them what every single button does. Only customize the minimal amount. So for example, what have I done here on my C70? I put this 11 button to be the digital IS image stabilization to turn it on and off. Up here in the front, the 10 button turns on and off the false color. And button number 7, I had turn on slow and fast mode so I can jump right to 120 frames per second. But that's already a lot of customizing. I don't want to go any further than that. Most cameras also have a custom menu so that you can quickly access your most changed preferences. And I would recommend setting that up as well. This is going to be to your taste, but take a look at it, make some changes. Another thing that you're ahead of the game because you're here right now is watch some YouTube videos about your specific camera, because reviewers will already have found some of the weird quirks and challenges of using it, and that can save you a lot of time not having to figure out all those details yourself. Or better yet, spend a few bucks and buy a course that is specifically breaking down every single detail about it. Like, I've watched hours of courses of my Sony cameras, which were little more complicated to use. Those were made by Dave Dugdale. I know DSLR Video Shooter has done this in the past. Rubidium from Crimson Engine has a great one for the Canon cinema cameras. Just search Google for it, see what's available. Paying a few bucks for a training course can teach you so much more than just a few 10-minute YouTube videos. And finally, most important, this kind of applies to everything we said, just go shoot a lot, like very often before you're working with this camera on a job. Shoot everything. I like to shoot our cats as often as I can. As soon as I get a new camera, I'm chasing them around the house. You gotta start memorizing where those buttons are and which ISOs you like to use, and just finding out the feel of the camera. Spend so much time on this when it doesn't matter. So even set up a test shoot, invite a friend over, set up your lights, treat it like it's a real client, and make all the mistakes before you've got somebody with a paycheck hanging over your shoulder. And if you've got a few bucks left in your pocket after purchasing that camera, I have some accessories to recommend, especially for filmmakers and YouTubers. So check out those videos. I think they're gonna help you out.